Hello, happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of The Practice. This show is a look into my digital art workflow. I'm Stuart. I'm a 3D artist, illustrator, designer, and your pal, and I'm excited to have you back. This week we're working on some beautiful, wonderful 3D typography, which honestly is one of my favorite things to work on, and it's been way too long since we've done any of this on an episode of The Practice, so glad to bring some your way. With this one, I had, I'm not sure exactly where it came to me. It sort of got the inspiration sometime yesterday to come up with a really positive catch-all saying that I could use in this piece. And I think make it better applies to a lot of things in life, The plan really is to, and you'll see this later, that we output this at a ridiculously huge size, but I wanted to turn this into a print piece that I could hang in my studio as a constant reminder to make it better, right? But what does that mean exactly, and how does it apply? Part of the reason I like it is because it's so catch-all. It encompasses a lot of things. Making it better, obviously, hanging in my studio, that's going to refer a lot of the time to the art. And I have a tendency with I guess, the way that I create I always want to make things quickly and then move on to the next one. And that's really great because it allows me to have a fairly high output. I think it's really important for learning. But it also makes me rush through things sometimes and maybe not spend the time sorting out some of the details that I should. And so that factors into this week's episode for a couple reasons. The second reason that I haven't mentioned yet is this is actually going to be a two-parter because I was having so much fun creating this and was enjoying working on the details so much that I thought that my typical 2-hour time frame wouldn't be enough to capture everything. So this episode is really part one of a two-part piece. And that two-part piece is going to be, actually quite satisfying, one of my favorites to date. And it's also going to be made available as a print for everyone else to pick up and potentially hang in their studios as well, right? And that's another reason why it's great that this make it better idea could apply to a lot of things, not just, our artwork, our design, the things we're working on, but potentially our lives and our attitudes as well, because even if you're normally a positive person and you don't lose your temper too much or freak out too much, I think there's still something to be said for making your attitude better, right? So it's it's a catch-all. It's applicable to many situations in life. So anyways, make it better is the slogan that I sort of landed on, the sort of feeling that was around yesterday, let's say. And that's the inspiration behind the typography here. Now, the background is an abstract expression of that idea. It's supposed to be, vibrant and explosive and, cheerful and colorful and, but still sort of abstract. And I think that applies to this sort of, I hate the term generic, but it's, readily applicable, let's say, to all types of situations in life. And I didn't want any specific bit of imagery to supersede that message. So really, the intention here is this is going to be this crazy abstract explosion of colors and shapes. And they're all really going to sort of radiate out from the center around the text, which I think gives it that sort of dust cloud explosion kind of look, but is also really great for leading the eye into the typography. So, it's at once kind of simple, since it's really just letters and some shapes that I'm repeating over and over again, but then it's also quite complex because there's lots of layers of them, and you'll see we'll get into a really bright, exciting sort of color palette. We lean really heavily into complementary colors and blues and oranges and yellows, and I'm really pleased with the way that turned out. But right now we're just fleshing out shapes, and as you can see, while I'm gabbing away over here, we're making some progress in filling out this background. What I did is I stuck to one color. I just wanted to focus on forms at first. So you see I'm just right in this light blue color. I'm just working on the composition. There's like a handful of sweeps and primitive shapes that I'm using here, and I'm just copying and pasting them and using actually the command drag, which is really useful feature. I can just grab an object, hold command, and drag it along, and it'll create a copy of it when I do. So I'm leaning into that quite a bit. And once I've added, let's call it a shape type, I repeat that shape type a lot. And we've only got, maybe 4 or 5 shape types here. We've got this squiggly type of thing that I'm moving around now. We've got the spheres that I'm using to sort of plug in little gaps. And I'm also using those to create these sort of scaly running patterns in a lot of areas. We've got a capsule that we're using in a lot of instances to make this outwardly radiating stripe. And then we've got this squiggly sweep that I made with formula sweep. And so just that simple collection of objects allows me to create this entire composition, which is fun. It's a challenge for me. There's a saying that good design relies on constraints, or constraints can help inform design. And I think that's true. I'll purposefully limit my color palette in a lot of instances. Like, this piece is a great example of that when we get into color. Just because it makes decision making easier, and sometimes it's difficult to manage an enormous palette or hundreds of different types of shapes. So, creating these little constraints for myself actually makes it easier, and it makes it better for me to, create a unified and like harmonious composition that works well. So limiting my choices actually in this instance has helped me create a composition that I think works well. So speaking of color palettes, we're about to start getting into it, and this is, the second half of this first episode really is all about filling in these color palettes and making them work nicely. So really, I'm just copying and pasting that original light blue material that I had made into some darker blues and into some yellows. That's really going to make up the vast majority of the color palette that we use. And so really, I'm just kind of squinting my eyes and zooming out and adding yellow and darker blue to certain areas of the palette, or certain areas of the canvas, let's call it, of the composition, and seeing what works. I want to balance things, like add a little yellow to one side, then add a little yellow to another side, then balance that with a little dark over here, and it's like a push and pull, and it's a bit of a process of adding and subtracting and moving things around, and just sort of fleshing out the colors in this scene. And I think it's easier to do that once the composition is mostly in place. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm certainly going to, change my mind on the placement of certain things. Like, here we go, I'm improving the line quality of that squiggle there. So there's definitely going to go in and alter some of the shapes, but most of the shapes are in place now, so I can really just focus on the colors. Another thing I decided is that even though the composition is totally filled in with shapes, I'm going to lighten or sort of make things sort of disappear using really light blue and a white color around the edges. That sort of opens up the composition and creates opportunities for the eye to sort of flow around things, creating little gaps of negative space. It improves the composition, and you're more likely to have your eye be led around. And that's one of the things that I think creates a satisfying piece to look at. Is the piece itself does a lot of the hard work in pushing your eye around. And so since I want this to be colorful and bright, and I want to keep the shading a little bit to a minimum, so I've taken on these materials, they're all pretty consistent materials, all rather simple materials. What I've done is I've added luminance in the same color as the material as the diffuse channel, the color channel they call it in cinema, which is really like your diffuse channel. And I backed out of the diffuse channel a little bit so that the shading wouldn't be quite as strong. And I added, like I said, some luminance in the same color as the diffuse channel, which also takes away some of the shading. And I turned those down just a little bit. And then in the reflection, we have our default specular layer, and I've turned that down quite a bit as well. That gives us this, light shading, but really colorful, bold kind of look. Now, we have one object that's really in the foreground, and I was finding as I was blocking in color, there was too much of a single color occupied by one particular shape. And that was kind of bugging me. So you see, just a minute ago, what I did was I made a gradient. And that went from light blue to sort of a middle blue. And that's what I added to that shape, that big squiggle just underneath the type in the middle of the composition. That sort of broke up some of that flat color for me. And I actually wound up using that gradient on a few of the thin capsule stripes that go out to the outer edges. It gave me a little bit of a color shift that I thought worked nicely. So you can see the overall colors are starting to take shape here. We've got, we've got a balance that we're looking to achieve. We're adding things in on one side and then the other. We don't want to go too, we don't want to have one whole half be all yellow, one whole half be all blue. We're kind of mixing things in. And that takes some time, but I had a blast making this, to be honest. It's a fun process. A little while into the coloring of all these objects, I found that I didn't have quite enough contrast. So you see, I made a pretty dark blue and a pretty dark like orangey red. And everything was feeling a little bit pale, a little bit too sort of in that middle range, in that light to middle range. And I thought that, we needed some contrast. We needed some additional contrast to make the piece work, just so there's that full range from black to white. Let's say we got plenty of white and light, but we needed some much darker colors. I think you could see as I'm comparing past renderings to one another, like I always do in this picture viewer here. You can see the piece really starts looking a lot better as those dark stripes go in. Another thing I've done for contrast is added these clone arrays of the little dots. You see there's some dark blue ones behind the I and T. Underneath the B, there's some dark red ones. And we've got a lot of really big, sort of soft, swooping shapes. And I wanted to use a little bit of a pattern to break that up. And what's great is the cloner tool makes it really simple to copy a tiny little circle across, an even and uniform space. That honeycomb array is really great because it's sort of a running pattern and things are offset by 50%. And then I use a step effector to create almost like a halftone pattern where the central dots in that array of dots are larger and they fade out into smaller sizes towards the edges. And I think in a little while here, I wind up copying those and making a few other versions because I thought that pattern and that texture was working so well. And speaking of patterns and textures, we get really deep into patterns and textures in the next episode where we bring this into Photoshop. The entire next episode is focused solely in Photoshop and bringing this thing to life with, not only retouching and removing a couple of the mistakes or the sort of weird glitches in the 3D forms. There's some odd bits created by the sweeps here that we wind up, just simply clone stamping in Photoshop. And then we add a ton of really beautiful patterns and textures and really improve the color overall. And I thought, in the rare instance that would warrant its own episode. And here I am taking screenshots like a weirdo of the different rendering processes because I love these as sort of a reminder of the stuff that I've done. And sometimes I think the pre-passes and renderings here are just as beautiful as the finished piece. So here we're knocking out some renderings, we're testing some different stuff. In this instance, I added a little bit of transparency to the materials just to kind of get a see-through look. But man, with the sort of high polygon nature of everything and the layering of everything, that turned out to be a mistake. The amount of visual improvement I got versus the amount of render time that was added was not a good trade-off. So I wound up killing any bit of transparency there. And also, I think I replaced that with a little bit of subsurface scattering, which I wind up testing as well. And that's another thing that really will hurt your render times. When I say hurt, I mean increase them enormously. But sometimes is really worth it. So you always got to make those choices and balance those. So. Here, like I mentioned, we're making a few tweaks to the placement of and some additional copies of this awesome textured dot pattern. I was really loving the way this was looking just totally flat with just this flat color preview in the viewer here. So I took a screenshot of that. And I found that when you added the subsurface scattering, it made things really sort of pale and washed out. So here I'm going through and turning up the saturation in the subsurface scattering channel in luminance in each of these objects. And now the only thing left to do for the first half of this special two-part series is set the rendering size way the heck up and output an enormous rendering. And with the beauty of video editing, I can spare you all from having to wait through that. So be on the lookout next week for a very special part 2 where we retouched this bad boy in Photoshop and add color and texture and really bring it to life. I'm super excited to make a print available of this piece, so check out the description below for a link to that. If you like this video, please hit subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to leave one in the comments below. If you want to keep up with me and the work that I'm doing, I'm at DLGNCE on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks so much. See you next week.